Welcome back. Picture a morning in early September, in the year 1666. The air along the river smells of wood smoke, tar, and yeast from the bakeries just waking up near Pudding Lane. Carts creak over cobbles. A baker named Thomas Fariner rakes the last coals from his oven before locking up for the night, certain, as anyone would be, that tomorrow will be an ordinary day. It will not be. Within hours, the city around him will begin to burn, and by the time the flames finally die, most of the London you might picture in your mind right now will no longer exist. Using AI recreated imagery, historic paintings, and the findings of archaeologists who have spent decades digging beneath modern streets, you're going to walk through this city as it rose, as it burned, and as it rebuilt itself again and again. And by the end, you'll see exactly what stands on these same spots today. To understand what was lost, you have to go back much further than that bakery. Nearly 2,000 years earlier, this stretch of the River Thames was marshland and gravel terrace, useful mainly because it was the lowest point where the river could still be bridged and the highest point still reachable by seagoing ships. Around the year 43, Roman soldiers crossed into Britain, and within a few years a small trading settlement took root here, one the Romans called Londinium. There was nothing grand about it at first. You would have seen timber buildings, muddy lanes, and a wooden bridge lashed together to move soldiers and supplies. The people scraping out a living on these riverbanks, tanners, boatmen, small merchants, had no way of knowing that their patch of mud would one day house millions, or that it would burn to the ground, be rebuilt in brick and stone, be bombed from the air and still stand, layer upon layer 2,000 years later. Londinium grew astonishingly fast for a Roman frontier town. By the year 100, it had become the largest settlement in Roman Britain, home to perhaps 30,000 people at its height, encircled eventually by a defensive wall over 3 kilometers long and nearly 6 meters high in places, built from Kentish ragstone hauled upriver by barge. Standing at its center, you would have found a forum and basilica larger than any built in Britain before or since, a civic hall stretching some 167 meters long, where merchants argued over shipping contracts and magistrates settled disputes beneath a timber roof supported by rows of stone columns. Nearby stood a Roman fort, a governor's palace with tiled floors and private baths, and a network of streets that still, remarkably, echo in the layout of the modern city of London today. None of it was finished or permanent in feeling. Excavated timbers show sections of the waterfront rebuilt again and again as the river shifted and old wharves rotted, a reminder that even at its most confident, this was a city constantly patching itself back together rather than a monument frozen in perfection. At the heart of civic and spiritual life stood temples to Roman gods, later joined by the quiet, secretive gatherings of early Christians meeting in private homes, and, discovered only in the 20th century beneath a bank basement, a temple to the mystery god Mithras, its altar and carved reliefs buried under rubble for 17 centuries before construction workers broke through in 1954. Courts operated near the Forum, where Roman law and centuries later medieval guild law drew the boundaries of who could trade, who could vote in civic matters, and who answered to whom. Layer beneath layer, archaeologists have found altars sitting almost directly above Saxon graves, which sit beneath medieval church foundations, each generation building its idea of order directly on top of the last, rarely bothering to clear away what came before. Down in the streets, daily life was loud, crowded, and intensely physical. Population estimates for medieval London by the 1200s run past 40,000, swelling toward 200,000 by the time of the Great Fire. You would have smelled tanneries and fish markets long before you saw them, heard the cries of street vendors selling eels, bread, and ale, and dodged waste tossed from upper windows into gutters that ran down the center of narrow lanes barely 3 meters wide. Wealthy merchants lived in timber-framed houses with jettied upper floors that leaned out over the street, sometimes close enough for neighbors across the lane to shake hands from their windows, while the poor crowded into single rooms and structures thrown up with little regard for fire safety. Graffiti and merchant marks scratched into Roman tile and medieval stone survive today, ordinary names left behind by people who never imagined anyone would read them 2,000 years later. If you wanted spectacle, you might have made your way to the amphitheater just north of the Roman fort, rediscovered only in 1988 beneath what is now the Guildhall Art Gallery, a timber and stone arena believed to have held several thousand spectators for gladiatorial contests, animal displays, and public executions. Centuries later, Spectacle took a different form nearby at the Globe and other playhouses across the river in Southwark, where in the late 1500s you could pay a penny to stand in the open yard and watch new plays by a young writer named William Shakespeare, jostled by thousands of fellow Londoners, some drinking, some heckling, all part of a shared civic ritual of entertainment that bound rich and poor together in the same crowd, if not the same seats. For privilege, nowhere compared to the riverside palaces that lined the Strand by the 1600s. Grand houses with private river stairs, walled gardens, and galleries of imported art, built by nobles and bishops who wanted to live close enough to the royal court at Westminster to matter, yet far enough from the crowded city to breathe. Inside, you would have found imported tapestries, carved oak paneling, and glass windows that were still, in this period, a luxury few could afford. Whatever comfort those walls promised, though, would prove no protection at all from what was coming. Fire does not check a deed of ownership before it spreads. The turning point came on the 2nd of September, 1666. It began small, a spark from that bakery oven on Pudding Lane sometime after midnight, catching dry timber in a summer that had left London parched after a long drought. At first, the local watch and the Lord Mayor himself dismissed it, reportedly remarking that a woman could piss it out, a decision that cost the city everything. Fed by strong easterly winds, temperatures inside the firestorm are believed to have exceeded 1200 degrees Celsius in places, hot enough to melt pottery and warp iron. The fire moved with terrifying, almost mechanical logic, leaping from thatch to timber to pitch-soaked warehouse, doubling in size roughly every half hour through the first full day. Londoners who had lived through minor fires before assumed this one, too, would be contained by midday. It was not. By the third day it had reached the old Roman and medieval heart of the city, consuming St. Paul's Cathedral so completely that molten lead from its roof reportedly ran down Ludgate Hill in the street. Fire breaks were finally created only when officials, in desperation, began demolishing houses with gunpowder to stop the fuel supply itself. By the time rain finally helped extinguish the last flames on the 6th of September, roughly 13,200 houses, 87 parish churches, and St. Paul's itself lay in ashes across some 175 hectares of the city, an area representing nearly the entire walled core of London. In the weeks after, the city was a landscape of blackened rubble, chimneys standing alone where houses had burned entirely away, refugees camping in fields outside the walls with what belongings they had managed to save. Remarkably, official records list only a handful of confirmed deaths, though many historians believe the true toll, especially among the poor whose losses went unrecorded, was almost certainly higher. Rebuilding began almost immediately, driven by a mix of grief, opportunity, and stubborn civic pride, though ambitious plans for wide new boulevards were largely abandoned in favor of rebuilding along the old medieval street pattern, simply because reorganizing land ownership proved too slow and too costly. Brick and stone replaced timber by royal decree, a change that would make the next great fire far less likely, and Christopher Wren was commissioned to design a new St. Paul's Cathedral, along with dozens of parish churches across the rebuilt city. For over 2 centuries afterward, the buried Roman and medieval layers beneath London were largely forgotten, paved over by Georgian streets and later by Victorian railways and sewers, remembered mostly in old maps and half-legendary place names. It was not until the intense rebuilding after the Blitz of the 1940s, when German bombing left craters across bomb sites throughout the city, that archaeologists finally had the access they needed to dig deep beneath the modern surface. What they found astonished even seasoned historians, from the Mithraeum's carved marble reliefs to perfectly preserved Roman shoes pulled from waterlogged riverside mud, their leather stitching still intact after nearly 2,000 years underground. Wooden writing tablets turned up bearing everyday Roman handwriting, invoices, IOUs, a schoolboy's practice alphabet, ordinary scraps of paper equivalents that somehow survived when so much else did not. It's worth pausing on that. Every foundation stone we've walked through together belonged to someone. A merchant closing his shutters for the night. A child scratching a name into wet clay. A family who lost everything in 3 days of fire and rebuilt anyway. These were not ruins waiting to become tourist attractions. They were homes. Today, you can still walk a preserved stretch of the old Roman wall near the Tower of London and Barbican, its lower courses genuinely Roman stone, the upper sections patched by medieval and later hands. The Guildhall Art Gallery sits directly above the excavated amphitheater, its curved outline traced in dark stone across the modern courtyard above. The Mithraeum has been beautifully reconstructed and reopened to the public beneath the Bloomberg headquarters, its temple walls rebuilt near their original riverside location. Rennes' St. Paul's Cathedral, completed in 1710, still dominates the skyline with its famous dome, one of the very churches born directly from the ashes of 1666. The Globe Theatre has been faithfully rebuilt near its original Southwark site, where you can once more watch performances beneath an open sky, and where the Strand's great riverside palaces once stood. Only a scattering of street names: Savoy, Somerset House. Thank you so much for walking through all of this with me. If there's a place, an event, or a lost city you'd love to see brought back to life like this, drop it in the comments. I genuinely read every suggestion, and constructive feedback always helps make the next one better. See you in the next episode.